Today's webinar is titled Introducing Human Factors to EMS Students, presented by Sam Henne. I'm going to pass it over now to our presenter. Sam, thank you so much for being here with us today to share your knowledge and experience with us, and we look forward to the presentation.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This is pretty exciting, considering I am not a full-time educator. I am a paramedic. So welcome to Human Factors in EMS, and kind of the subtitle for this is the 12 soft skills that your students should be learning. So a little bit about me. I am a paramedic. I've been a paramedic for 10 years. I've been involved in EMS for the last 15. Um, I'm currently a flight paramedic up here in the Northwood. And I'm also the founder of a company called Mind Over Medic, where we teach human factors to EMS, the kind of the whole spectrum of EMS. So I'm really excited to be here as somebody who is not a formal educator, somebody who is not making my living off of teaching EMS, but rather somebody who is in the field and kind of being directly influenced by those of you who are teaching. So it's exciting for me to get to kind of share some of my perspective and input to kind of the education body of EMS. So getting into this, we're going to be talking about kind of the overview of human factors as it pertains to EMS, but more specifically, how the human factors that go around critical incidents. So the high fidelity human performance side of things. We're going to talk about human factors in performance, resilience, psychological trauma prevention, and how they're all very closely interrelated. And kind of the importance of introducing these concepts really early in EMS. So, from EMT school, paramedic school, as preceptors, as field training officers, being able to exemplify these pieces of being human in a very difficult job. So I do have my disclaimer down there at the bottom. I'm not here to sell a product or defame anybody or anything like that. I'm just strictly here to talk about human performance and human factors in this job. So when we talk about human factors, we talk about the fact that we are not training, we're not programming a computer here. We are educating people, and the operating systems are a bit more complex. There's things like free will and emotions and decision-making, critical thinking, bandwidth, and neuroplasticity that all plays a role in how we act and how we perform. And also the fact that we can injure it and we can create the wrong, we can download the wrong software. So these human factors are very, very important because they play a role in almost every single action we take in EMS, because everything can come down to an action or a reaction. So we want to be cognizant of that as we are introducing students to EMS. I think this quote really sums up what human factors are. So without question, education is important, but it's the ability to blend academics with the physical, emotional, and mental aspects of our craft that enables us to be effective, by Von Appen. I think I'd like to draw attention to the use of the word effective, because being effective in this job has a lot more to do than being able to follow a protocol. Being able to pass an ET tube through the and keep them alive. Being effective as a medic has so much more to do with being able to have longevity, to not burn out, to not be completely traumatized by our craft. EMS is an enriching experience and be a rewarding career versus the kind of thing that we just do for a little bit and then go move on to something else. I think we're all aware that EMS has a very short career lifespan. And I think a lot of that comes down to burnout. It comes out to, people leave because of psychological trauma. People are leaving for lots of reasons that have to do with how we respond to the world around us. So that's what we're going to explore a little bit. So we kind of make this job. Hold on, let me make sure we didn't. Yeah, we skipped a big piece here. We make this job hard with how we perceive the world. So I want to talk a little bit about the human response, how we perceive critical incidents, how we perform through them, and a little bit about what the effects of that is on us. So it all starts long before we're ever exposed to a critical incident. Our mindset and perspective play a huge role in how we're going to approach and perceive the world around us. So our mindset is kind of, where we're sitting right now, how, the lens that we're looking at the world through. And then our perspective is what that mindset lets us see. And then it feeds into our perception, which our perception then becomes kind of a pseudo reality. The way we perceive the world becomes the way we physically respond to it. It's the way we believe things are. So our mindset is kind of the thing that starts all that. To give you an example of this, probably 6-7 years ago, I'm working multiple EMS jobs, 70 to 95 hours a week. And I am just burnt out, right? And a lot of my burnout is coming from the fact that so many of our calls just aren't emergencies, right? We work in emergency medicine and we don't actually see a lot of emergencies, do we? Right? We respond to calls, and I mean, I think you could probably say upwards of 70% of what we respond to can't in any way, shape, or form be interpreted as an emergency. But I was tired of this. We are the emergency medical services, and that's how I viewed myself. I was here to treat life-threatening emergencies. So I was becoming angry with the fact that none of these calls were emergencies. I would do a quick assessment. I would look at my partner and be like, yeah, you're good with this, right? And I would, downgrade it to BLS, and off we would go. And I was angry at our profession because this was the reality of it. I was angry at the public for abusing the system. I was angry at kind of my life choices here. So I really wasn't performing very well based on the fact that my whole mindset was built around the fact that this is emergency medicine. So I played a little mind game with myself. I decided I'm going to change my mindset. I'm going to try to, play some games here, and it's very semantic. So I don't know if it'll really work or not, but what if I relabeled myself as pre-hospital medicine, right? What if I said, okay, well, I'm pre-hospital medicine. I'm not emergency medicine, right? Because now this kind of takes away the expectations that my patients need to meet a certain acuity to be worth my time. So I would consciously decide, like, no, I'm not emergency medicine. I'm pre-hospital medicine every time the pager would go off. And it took a lot of consistently reminding myself this. But what I noticed was that I would go on a call, and instead of looking at it as a pain in the butt for not being an emergency, I would do an assessment and I would try to figure out what I could do for their particular problem. So my patients no longer really required a certain level of acuity for me to try to find a way to help them. And what this ended up doing was it kind of changed this mindset shift, changed my perspective, and changed the way I responded to my whole world. And my perception of incidents changed, and the way I reacted to them changed. So mindset itself is an incredibly important thing to sort of shape early in a career, right? It's kind of a shame that so many EMS students come out and their realization that so much of what we do is subacute. They realize this, and it's a surprise to them, and they're shocked by it. So these are the sort of mindsets that we can be shaping early as educators. So because it plays such an important role in how they perceive their job and then how they respond to their job. So once you've interpreted, once you've perceived an incident, right? Once you say, okay, well, this is a really bad incident, right? You're going to start to feel emotions about it. Emotions are good. Emotional control, a lot of us think of, being very stoic, right? But emotions are good. They're an important part of being human. So knowing what good emotions are, what bad emotions are, and knowing what and how to let your emotions influence you or not influence you, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But so we start to feel emotions regarding the incident, and then we kind of have the physical response that comes with that. The physical response is stress, right? And stress is good. Stress is motivating. Stress is there for a reason, right? Sympathetic nervous system serves a very important purpose, right? It keeps us motivated. It keeps us focused. It gives us energy to do the task that's needed. It's when it becomes too much stress that we start to see kind of that crossover into distress. So when we have a physical stress response that exceeds the needs of that moment, which are perceived based on our perception of that incident, that we start to lose things like fine motor skills. We lose peripheral vision. We have heightened sensory, but yet not really great processing for that sensory. And then that increases or decreases our cognition once we pass into that distress zone, right? So the cognition I'm talking about specifically, kind of that focused part of your brain, that part that has the ability for critical thinking and decision making, right? Not so much the automatic part where we have, where we're diving into heuristics and mental models to make our decisions. And then when we have this excessive stress response, as you can imagine, we don't necessarily recover as well. We have much more difficulty recovering. But I'd really like to point out here that the point of injury for PTSD, the point of injury, the piece of the stress response that creates psychological trauma is that moment from what we perceive as the reality of an incident to our physical stress response elicited from that perception, right? That is the moment where psychological trauma occurs, right? That is the point where essentially you fry your neural pathways, and then that becomes kind of the hard packed path for stress response moving forward. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how we can influence all of these things with 12 specific human factors that we can kind of introduce really early, as in EMT school and paramedic school, and even more experienced providers. These are things that we can absolutely learn to do, but it takes very cognizant effort to actually put these pieces into place. So we make things critical, right? Yes, there's an aspect of gore and trauma that tends to increase our ability to or increase our chances of psychological trauma, right? But a lot of what makes things critical is our own perception and our own response to things, right? So critical incident stress itself is an elevated threat perception with excessive sympathetic nervous system response. So it's a highly negative perception coupled with a physical response that exceeds the ability or exceeds the need of the moment, right? So threat perception, to break that down, that's kind of goes into what's called a cognitive assessment. So cognitive assessment that would create a high threat perception is, how bad is this? Once again, incredibly subjective marker, right? How prepared am I for this? And then what are the consequences of this, right? So if I see something as being incredibly severe, I feel underprepared for it, and I know that the consequences to this will be catastrophic. Now I know that my threat perception is going to be very high, and that's going to be my perceived reality, and it's going to create an excessive sympathetic nervous system response, an excessive physical response to this. So when we get into dealing with threat perception, severity is fairly subjective, right? And if you'd like an example of how this all works, nobody gets PTSD from watching gory movies, right? Because I mean, the gore is there. It might be triggering for people who have experienced trauma, but watching the movie doesn't create the traumatic event. Okay, so at least not in adults. I mean, there's definitely some science that could back up this happening in children, but that's because their ability to perceive it is different. They take things a lot more literal. Their ability to delineate between what is not real versus real is different than an adult. But an adult watching a gory movie, the chances of developing PTSD from that is very, very slim, because because we don't have the actual threat perception to that, right? Whereas in real life, when we're exposed to gore, suddenly there's that connection to it that creates the sympathetic nervous system response to it, right? So we have a very, very subjective way of responding to the incidents. And this is important for students to know, because that EMT student who does chest compressions for the very first time and feels those ribs crack underneath him, and he's doing that on that 90-year-old nursing home patient, right? That is going to be a much more traumatic event for him than, say, the experienced provider that knows that this is probably the natural end of life. There went my severity, right? Severity just came right down for me, right? Whereas the new EMT is not necessarily thinking of it in that term, right? The new EMT is also wondering, do I have what it takes to do this? Am I going to do a good job? They're not as confident in their ability to run a code. So their preparedness score is way high. And their perceived consequences to this is, if I don't do a good job, I might not progress through my training. But also, if I don't do a good job, this person's going to die. Whereas, the experienced medic is going to have kind of that, well, the consequences of this is this patient maybe gets to, pass on and not be subject to, life in an ICU. So the consequences that an experienced medic perceives of this event is very different than what a new person will. All right, so here's kind of a list of 12 actionable things that we can teach that directly affect the human factors surrounding high stress incidents. So we're going to start with mindset and perception management. I already kind of shared the how I was able to change kind of my progression into burnout by changing my mindset a little bit surrounding that. There's a lot of other examples of mindset management here and perception management that will change the way that we respond to things. Another example would be, we kind of elevate saving lives as our mantra in EMS, right? It's very, we save lives for a living. And we tie so much of our identity to that. We have the t-shirts, we have, the sayings, the slogans, the memes, they're all out there, right? The connotation to saving lives is that when somebody dies, we lose a life. That most of us will kind of say, oh, well, it's not that I own losing a life. It's, I understand that, death is a natural part of life, and that, sometimes it's just that person's time or whatever. But we all kind of want to come back and celebrate the life saved, and coming up with excuses for why it's okay for people to die is sort of the first step in pushing things down, right? It's sort of the first step in dismissing the bad parts, but only owning the good parts, right? And what do we know about a lifelong EMS provider that dismisses the bad stuff, right? If we start the habit of dismissing the fact that bad things happen, we're shoving it all in the corner at that point. And these are things that are going to come back, and they're going to rear their ugly head again in the future. So I think it's important to kind of not get in the habit of celebrating the good things and then dismissing the bad. I would recommend maybe going more towards owning the good with the bad, and understanding that, I'm not the person that has wrecked this person's car. I'm not the person that's causing this person to have a heart attack. I'm not the person that, drowned this other person, right? I am strictly somebody here to give somebody the best chance at survival. And whether they win or lose, I get to walk away proud of myself for the role that I played in humanity, right? So I get to go on a call, and if that person lives, I get to be proud of the chance that I gave them. If that person dies, I still get to be proud of the chance that I gave them. Does that make sense? So kind of not dismissing the bad things that happen, but kind of owning the piece that you actually have any sort of responsibility in, right? Okay, so training for performance. Well, that's what most of us do as educators, right? We train people to perform under pressure. I think it's important to teach EMT students, to teach medic students. This is something that when I have new orientees with me, I like to explain to them the science behind training for performance, because I want them to understand and be invested in what we're doing, right? And it's also one of those things that I know that when I'm done orienting a new flight clinician, that it's going to be up to them to kind of continue that path, right? It's not over. So when your students come out, if they know how to train themselves, how to practice the right way, how to do these things the right way, this is something that's going to set them up for success in the future. Because so many of us we're putting, if you're a paramedic educator or an EMT educator, you're kind of hitting this sort of minimum standard, and then we're pushing them out into the world in hopes that that's just the jumping off point for them to continue. So if we're going to push them out in hopes that they continue, if we can kind of set the basics for, hey, here's how you should continue. Here's how you should keep training yourself. Here's how you should keep practicing, right? So kind of bringing it back to that incremental mastery of performance, how to develop mental models and heuristics, and how to do.
Sorry, everybody. If we can just hang tight for 1 minute here while we get Sam back in. It looks like maybe we lost internet connection. So if you could just bear patience with us, I would appreciate it. Thank you so much.
We use. Sorry, Rio, are we still
Yeah, we're good. But
something glitched?
I think your presentation's down. So if you want to get that back up.
Oh, is it no longer
No, I think
there?
whenever it disconnected you, it took it down, but that's okay.
Okay, let me get back into that. Is it back?
Yep, we are good to go.
All right, good. All right, so engineering controls, this is the equipment that we use. So not all equipment that we use is designed very well for us to use it under pressure. Um, I think of the Sapphire pumps that we use at my job. They have very, very sticky touch screens. Right? They take a lot of pressure, and in order to make any kind of changes, you've got to hit multiple buttons multiple times. So when things are really highly pressurized, that's one thing for me that kind of starts taking up a lot of my bandwidth. It starts taking up a lot of my mental capacity, because it's like, okay, is my medication actually running? Is things actually doing way? Is this pump working the way I want it to be working? It takes a lot of focus off of other things. So think about the ventilators that you use. Is it the ventilator with the most options, or is it the ventilator that is easy to use? The monitors, even the litters that we use, the stair chairs, etc. Are we using equipment that is well designed, or are we going with things that maybe are a little, maybe not as good? So the idea behind mastering the engineering controls, we have three options, right? We can deal with it, like get good at using it, right? We can master it. We can change it. We can get a different piece of equipment, right? Or advocate for change, or we can leave it. We can go somewhere that has a piece of equipment that works better, right? Those are our three major options, right? What isn't an option is wallowing in misery, right? So, and so many times, when we work in this job, we sit around and we complain about problems without mastering the problem, without fixing the problem. Um, so, learning to find solutions to problems instead of just letting everything slide is a very important thing to kind of introduce early. Other things that we can kind of lump into engineering controls would be policies and protocols. If your protocols aren't easy to use or, have, aren't written in a way that lets you perform well in the moment, it might be a good idea to re-look at those protocols. A policy that I always struggled with was mandatory overtime. I liked my job. I could come in and perform well and bring a positive mindset and a positive attitude to my job. But as soon as I was mandated to come in on a day off when I had other plans, now I was miserable about it. Now my mindset went to crap. Now, kind of my whole ability to perceive and respond to the stresses around me changed, right? So that would be another example of a policy that affects your ability to perform. So kind of bringing awareness to how policies, procedures, equipment all affect your ability to perform is an important thing to introduce early. All right, emotional control. Again, a lot of times we kind of think of stoicism. We think of, bottle up your emotions. We think of this isn't the time to show emotion. And maybe it isn't always the time to show emotion. But being aware that emotions are normal and appropriate, a part of being a human, is important. What is important to bring into the picture, though, is understanding how emotions play a role in decision making. Emotions play a huge role in action versus reaction. So, as a kid, I was scared of the dark. Sure, we'll say as a kid. I was scared of the dark, and I would, get ready to go to bed, and there was, I'd had my toys all over the floor, and the bed's on the opposite side of the room, and I would, stand by the light switch by the door, and I would, flip the light closed, and then, all of a sudden the fear of the unknown, everything that could exist in the dark would overcome me, and I would sprint to my bed, dive under the covers in safety, right? Well, that's very reactionary, right? It's subjective emotion. It's the subjective fear emotion. So, that would result in a reaction that was probably not the best human performance, right? Because the real danger here wasn't the monsters that could exist in the closet. It was, the very real danger of stepping on the Legos on the way to the bed. So, being able to turn the light off, understand that, yes, I'm afraid, but these are the steps and the actions that I need to take to get to where I want to go to safely. This is how we need to get there. So kind of relaying this example into EMS terms, right? This is the classic, oh my God, this is a really bad kid. I feel really underprepared for this. I don't remember how to run a pediatric arrest well. So we are going to, just throw them in the truck. We're going to beat feet to the hospital and try to make it somebody else's problem as soon as we can, right? It's very fear-based on underpreparedness and results in a reaction versus, okay, hold on, stop, slow down. What are the steps that I need to do here? Let's go back to the ABCs, right? So understanding how your emotions are going to affect what you're going to want to react with is more important than kind of squelching emotions. Decisiveness. So this is something that new EMS providers struggle with a lot, and honestly, even seasoned providers. The more complex a situation becomes, our ability to make decisions um, decreases because we feel that we're, the actions of our decisions, the downstream effect of a wrong decision could be catastrophic. It could be awful. So we sometimes, become fear bound in our decisions. So kind of understanding how to build a decision base, right? How to, okay, I don't remember what decision I need to make at this point. So we're just going to go back to the beginning. We're going to do start with the basics, the ABCs, right? Or, start with getting the monitor on and getting those vital signs. And, I'm not really sure exactly what move this patient's going to need. So we're going to start with this and we're going to see if that works. And then, based on whether this works or doesn't work, then we'll make this decision based on that, right? So building a foundation of small decisions to kind of build up to your big decisions. How to play the devil's advocate, how to do the pro con list, right? Well, I think we should intubate. Well, what if we don't? Right. And then, switch into that in your head and say, okay, well, this is the road of intubating. This is the road of not intubating. And which road do I like the best? Because the effect of indecision just you either end up frozen in fear or your stress response just starts to skyrocket after that because you're just not sure if you're making the right choices, right? So learning how to be decisive is a huge factor. Stimulation control. So this is kind of directly affecting that overwhelming sympathetic nervous system response, right? So square breathing, this actually directly innervates the vagus nerve. Grounding techniques. Some of these grounding techniques, there's a whole lot of them. I like to recommend people kind of feel their own pulse first. I think that's a great one. Other things I like to do, some of these are kind of very situationally dependent, right? But if I'm landing on a very crazy scene somewhere and I'm getting out of that helicopter, or I just load the patient into the helicopter, I might take a minute and pick a tree and say, okay, I'm going to remember that tree, right? And it takes your focus off of all the stress of everything that's happening just for a second and says, okay, that tree exists. This is what it looks like, right? And then you're kind of bringing yourself back into a situation, and it kind of pulls you out of your stress response and helps you reset just a little bit. Creating a mantra. I'll give you an example of my personal mantra. My personal mantra is calm, confident mind. So when I'm feeling overwhelmed, when I'm feeling super stressed out, I'll just kind of repeat that to myself. Then it kind of brings me back to where I want to be. Positive self-talk. This is not the same thing as ego inflation. Positive self-talk is, okay, I've been trained on pediatrics. I remember how to do this. I remember the anatomical differences in airway. I know that I'm going to use my Hantevi or my Broslow, and I'm going to, use that as my reference point. And I'm going to, do this procedure versus, self-inflation would be, I'm a good medic. I got this. I know what I'm doing. Everybody thinks I'm good at my job. Because none of that is based in fact, right? That's all completely subjective. So positive self-talk needs to be brought back to things that are tangible. Smile. It's hard to be angry. It's hard to be, negatively stressed when you're happy. I'm not talking, the superficial grin of yeah, here, hand me your dead baby, right? I'm talking, generally being pleasant, right? And coming into a scene and being okay, so, how can I help you? What can I do to make the situation better? That sort of thing. Unclench your jaw. I like this one. So this kind of follows the whole purposefully relaxing muscle groups, right? And that's a good thing to do, let your shoulders droop or something like that. I like unclenching your jaw because it actually takes focused effort for me to relax my jaw in a stressful moment like that. Be quiet. I like this. When everybody else is very stimulated, voices go up. Be the person that's helping to bring everything down. And check in with yourself, right? Schedule check-ins, schedule little timeouts, right? If I know that I'm going on a very stressful call, getting into the aircraft, we're all, out of our critical phase of flight, we're in flight, headed to a scene. Okay, check in with myself. How am I doing? Right? Get in the back of the ambulance or get onto the scene, do my assessment before I do any major interventions. Deep breath, check in with myself. How am I doing? Am I making the right decisions? Yep. Okay, let's keep going. Patients loaded back into the aircraft. We do our reassessment, another reassessment for myself, right? Okay, how am I doing? Right. So if you can kind of have these phases of a call kind of mapped out and where these check-ins fit kind of naturally, kind of learning where to put these check-ins is important. Scene management. So this is something that I was very fortunate in my paramedic program. This is something I felt that we learned very well. Working with programs across the country, there's some that have done it well and some that don't seem to do it as well. So, learning how to arrive on a chaotic scene and kind of bring things down a couple of notches. How to manage those extrinsic distractions, those bystanders that want to be a part of this but don't know how to help well. Being able to redirect them a little bit, integrating them into the team, even integrating yourself into a team, right? As a paramedic going out and rendezvousing with a BLS service, or as a flight paramedic going and rendezvousing with an ambulance somewhere, being able to get into the back of that ambulance and not take over, but become an addition to their team, right? So to be able to come in and you might be the highest trained person on a scene, but being able to come in and say, hey guys, what do you think? What do you guys want to do? How can I help you? Is often a very, very important piece of scene management. Again, we kind of have to keep moving through these. I can't get too specific in how to introduce this kind of education into a classroom, just because this is a lot to get into in just an hour. Crew resource management. So this is kind of the idea of error prevention with an acknowledgement of the fact that humans exist. So it's a lot about communication and responsibility in your role, utilizing chains of command, checking your ego, these sorts of things. So crew resources management is an incredibly important part of how we respond to stress. I've been a part of the CISM teams, and one of the big things that come up as stressors when we debrief critical incidents is communication didn't go well. I didn't know who was over here. I didn't know who was over there. The communication aspect tends to be a huge theme when people come back from really, really stressful incidents. Debriefing and pre-briefing. This is a skill. And probably the most important part of the skill is the ability to own mistakes. The ability to own mistakes has to start with feeling safe to make mistakes, right? So, in the classroom, you got to feel safe to make mistakes. You got to know, um, that it's going to be okay, that we're going to make a mistake and we're going to use that as a learning opportunity, right? So it's kind of how we shape failure into um, an opportunity versus a negative action. So and the same thing with the cultures within the companies that we work with. Like that's kind of an important part of just culture. But understanding how to come off of a really bad call, fill the needs. This is am I too hot? Am I up? Am I thirsty? Get something to drink. Am I hungry? Get something to eat. Right. This isn't oh, let's hit the EMS room and get a bunch of sugary caffeine drinks. Right. This isn't let's slam another monster and head off to the next one. Right. Fill the basic physical needs first. This isn't the time to tell your buddies the story of what happened, because once you start telling the story of what happened, it starts robbing your ability to objectively debrief a call. Allow your physical stress response to kind of return to a baseline. And then the way I like to debrief, I like to do a quantitative versus qualitative. So I like to kind of spell out what happened first, right? In order, in chronological timing, what actually happened, and then why did those things happen, right? Why did I make the decisions that I made, right? And a lot of times I find that when I do it this way, okay, even if I made a decision that wasn't necessarily the greatest decision in the world, if it's something that with the information that I had in that moment, that might have still been the best decision to make, right? This is maybe it's the dissecting AAA that presented with chest pain, shortness of breath, right? So you gave the aspirin, nitro, heparin, etc., right? And then they ruptured, bled out, and you're like, oh man, I gave fibrinolytics to a patient that was bleeding to death, right? Well, maybe in that moment, with only the information that you had, maybe that was not the wrong decision, right? And being able to kind of come back and realize that it can really sometimes kind of relieve some of the stress a little bit. Needs to be a lot of emphasis on owning your performance, right? Coming back from a call and being like, well, that sucked, they probably weren't going to live anyway, is not an appropriate debrief. And there's no owning your performance. And if you can't own your performance, you can't improve your performance. Memory creation happens a lot when we sleep. So, try not to do things that are going to alter your ability to sleep. Alcohol doesn't improve memory creation during sleep. So, avoid alcohol before you've had a chance to, rest. We tend to we remember the perception of the event. Again, coming back to that perception thing, we remember our perception of the event because that's what our reality was. So you got to be cognizant of maybe widening your perception and saying, okay, well, what did my partner see? What was their perception of this event? You got to identify the improvement areas. You got to create action plans. You have to create action plans to say, okay, you know what, this sucked. I didn't do a good job. So now I have to do something about that, right? If I don't try to improve, I'm doing myself, that is the failure, right? Stress inoculation, what it is, what it isn't. Well, it isn't it isn't flashing lights, yelling people, and chaos. If that's all stress inoculation was, um, stress clubs, stress nightclubs wouldn't exist, right? Concerts wouldn't exist, right? That those things would be way too stressful. So it's not about the external stimulus. It's about the internal stimulus that you can provide. There's a lot of science that goes into stress inoculation. Just the act of providing extra things on top of it is not, just making things complicated for the sake of making things complicated is not stress inoculation per se. You have kind of two options with stress inoculation. You have, am I getting better? Am I training to get better at performing under stress? Am I training to say, okay, can I intubate while stressed out versus training to be able to keep my stress level minimum while under chaotic situations, right? And if we're going to do stress inoculation training, we kind of have to delineate which of those we're going to do, because there's different science that goes into either one of those options. Physical fitness, this kind of is self-explanatory. Physical fitness has a lot to do with how we process and how we metabolize stress hormones. When I come back from a bad call, if I work out, that's a great way to work off stress hormones quickly. If I have a lot of adipose tissue, if I have a lot of, I will store stress. I will store cortisol. I will store those things in my body and hold on to them longer. If I need my sympathetic nervous system to be all the way turned on in order to get up the stairs to get to my patient, I'm going to have a very difficult time, just taking a square breath or trying to manage my sympathetic nervous system if I need it just for the physical aspect of the job. Mental stress becomes physical stress. The more we carry mentally, the more physically stressed we become as well. So it works both directions there. So that's kind of the importance of physical fitness within this career. So in conclusion here, effective EMS people are not just people who can do the job well. They're people who understand the humanity of the job. They're people who understand how to be a human in a world where you're doing some very hard things. So I'm hoping that through this short presentation that you can see how human performance, mental resilience, and psychological trauma are very closely tied together. If we want to take steps at increasing longevity in EMS, if we want to take steps against preventing psychological trauma, PTSD, burnout, it can all start with us in their very formative years in EMS. So as EMS educators, kind of my call to action to you is these are the things that we can set the groundwork for. These aren't necessarily things that we're going to be able to easily test or, measure objectively in a classroom, but these are the sorts of things that we can introduce the concepts to and, kind of give them the tools to continue growing and building these principles throughout their career. I do have a ton of references here, and that's all I have for my presentation here. We can open it up for some questions.
If anyone has any questions, please feel free